The reason that I'm going to talk to you today about thinking styles, that's my subject, thinking styles, is because in my life to date, working either as a sort of senior guy in big multinational companies or advising companies, I always used to wonder who cottoned on to my ideas and who didn't. And sometimes who hated them almost instinctively. And sometimes people fell in love with them and I didn't even think that they were that great. And I began to realize that it was not so much necessarily the strategies or the depth of argumentation, but it was sometimes the words I chose, the way I was speaking, the way you actually meet someone. And I'd like to suggest to you that that is appropriate to most of you in the world of admissions, because you're often meeting people who you've either never seen before or you've no idea what they're like. And you'd perhaps like to read their brains, but you can't. Perhaps it's good, because if you could read theirs, maybe they could read yours as well. And that might not be so good, and not all of the time at least. But I'm going to try and give you some clues as to how you can, to at least a certain extent, look inside the brains of people around you, those who you work with, or those who you come in contact with, or those who you're trying to influence. And in that respect, I put together what I promise is a very short PowerPoint, and I'll talk my way through it, just reviewing the thinking style situation. So David, if you allow me to share screen, I think I can do that. Is that right? Then just for a few minutes, I'm going to share with you this short PowerPoint. With a bit of luck, you can see a big screen saying thinking styles. Have you all got that? Those of you who've got a screen in front of you, have you all got that in front of you? Great, thank you. Thinking styles, and there's a picture of a brain because it all has to do with the brain. All our brains are very, very similar. I mean, sometimes people will talk about male brains and female brains. There's no such thing really. I mean, we have things that we perhaps relate to slightly differently, but you could just as well talk about somebody who has a brain which is better connected at the front and the back, or better connected at the left on the right-hand side, or better connected up and down. Brains are wonderful things and they're wonderfully interconnected, and they give us something called a thinking style. And this is the only chart which I have which actually has lots of words on it, and I'm going to read it through to you, because if we're talking about thinking styles, it's not something that we often refer to. We sometimes talk of personalities. This is not personalities. So thinking styles exist at the interface between cognition and personality traits. Thinking styles are preferred ways of applying one's intellectual abilities and acknowledge to a problem. I stress that word, preferred ways of applying one's intellectual abilities. So two people may have equal levels of intelligence, but differ completely on how they focus their abilities on a task. For example, research indicates that some thinking styles promote creativity, where others can diminish it. This is just one of many discussions about thinking styles. This is from a piece of research done about 25 years back by Todd Lubat. But thinking styles have nothing to do with intelligence. Thinking styles imply that our brains are, at least to a certain extent, pre-wired, in the same way as, well, you're either left-handed or right-handed. You can't necessarily do something about it. You can influence it, but one hand is just a bit more efficient than the other. And the way we think about things, some things come more naturally to us than others. And in that respect, I'm going to show you two little charts here of ways of separating thinking styles, of ways of classifying thinking styles. And as you'll see, let me see if I can just get my annotation working. Just one second. As you'll see, we have two different thinking styles categorized here. One is, at least in brain terms, the so-called frontal left. And these are people who like to think very logically. They negotiate, they set priorities, they like to measure things. And as you'll see, it is poles apart from the diagonally opposite part of the brain, which tends to prefer thinking in this way. So again, for Ewan, who probably isn't looking at this on the screen, we're seeing two diagonally opposed areas. One represents those logical thinking styles I was talking about. The other represents senses of encouragement, belonging, harmonizing, concern for other people. And in terms of thinking styles, the key point I'd like you to take from this is that you can't be doing both at the same time. So people you meet, you yourselves, everyone around you, tends to prefer one of these thinking styles to another. And perhaps when you sit together in groups afterwards, virtual groups, and have a chat, you'd like to think about which are you. Are you more the decider, or are you more the connector? Because one thing is quite clear, you can't be both. You can't make pretty tough, logical, clear decisions whilst at the same time encourage people to be belonging and harmonizing. To give one brief, rather painful example from my earlier life, I used to work at Levi Strauss, and the unfortunate job I was given at a time when clothing and manufacturing was being outsourced to China, I had the job of closing a factory in Texas. At least I wasn't doing much of the individual work, but I was responsible for the complete project. So I had to put down the complete case for how much money we should invest in looking after people, retraining, helping the local community, doing these basal right things, encouraging, harmonizing, trying to keep people together. At the same time, in the interests of the investors in the company and the bankers and all the very logical decision makers who you get involved with, I had to clearly negotiate hard, set clear priorities and targets. And it was almost an impossible balancing act. And it illustrated to me perfectly that, at least when it comes to me, in the end, I'm more of the connector, because if it comes between making the very toughest decisions and making one which is a compromise that benefits people, then generally I will make the one that benefits people. There are others who, and sometimes that's really necessary, will make the tough decision that benefits, no, we've got to do this, even if it's not for the good of people in the short term. So that's the sort of compromise that you end up making in situations like this. And there is another example of what we have here. Let me flick onto this. Just one moment. There are another set of opposites which you have here, and this is the detailer and the creator. On the left-hand side, you'll see this is one thinking style, which is a normative thinking style. It's one which makes you generally rather successful in school, for example. If you have attention to detail, you have very procedural thinking, you like to keep to schedules and routines, you're a detailed person. But on the other hand, you have the creator. And admittedly, there are more detailers in civilization than in society than creators, but both are important. And the creator tends to be more innovative, enjoys troubleshooting, sometimes risk-taking. They will take a risk rather than do the same thing time and time again. And yet again, you can't do both at the same time. So you have to be in one camp. So when you sit in your little virtual groups, I would appreciate it if you think to yourself, are you more the detailer or are you the creator? And if you think you're balanced between the two, how do you manage that? Because it is extremely difficult, if not impossible. Forgive me, I'm just clearing all drawings so I can flick forward. Okay, to make that a little bit more easy to understand, then I'll show you that when I'm working with companies, and I've done this with David and Suzette and various people at ISB and quite a lot of companies, you actually end up with something like a kite, and this would be an example of it. You see, it shows you that you are, this particular person is very strong in one area down here. This is the basal left, so they are a routine sort of person, and weaker in the other areas. And everybody has one core area of strength, usually shared with another. In this case, this particular person is more strong across these basal areas. We won't go into more detail of that now, but it just gives you an idea of how that actually works for an individual person. So when you're putting together the thinking styles, then you have basically people who are these people who are naturally strong when it comes to finance, mathematical analysis, weighing up variables, prioritizing. And in the opposite area, you have those that are good at nurturing, celebrating, encouraging, showing compassion, soothing, and harmonizing. And the other diagonal which comes into it is the other one I referred to, where imagination and creativity and troubleshooting tend to dominate. Or on the left, basal left, where routine and detail is there. And the thing is, each of us has one of these as a strong lead. But when we talk of diversity, we tend to talk about, I know, male and female, or we might refer to someone's hair color or eye color or color of skin, whatever it happens to be. It can be religion, it can be many things. And I would like to suggest to you, we should more often be talking about diversity of the way we think about things, because you can have two people who look totally different and yet have exactly the same way of thinking about things. I would give you an example, perhaps that, for an example, I once did an analysis of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, not in his presence, but with a group of people, one of whom had met him and knew him. And we clearly, perhaps not surprisingly, said that the great religious leader from South Africa was a basal right. Perhaps rather obviously, many religious leaders are, because they are harmonizers. They bring people together. Now, he happens to be a Black South African, and yet in the team that David leads, certainly, we have a number of white females who are not from South Africa, look totally different from Desmond Tutu, but again, exactly have this profile and would lead with that. And as I said, sometimes we need to perhaps focus a little bit more on these differences, because when somebody comes into an admissions area, for example, you have no idea what they think of, how they think. If they are, for example, interested in your school because you're a caring school and you look after people and the education really reflects their well-being, then you would be doing the right thing to be emphasizing these aspects down here. If, on the other hand, the person who you're talking to is actually much more interested in results, passing the IB, getting high grades, give me the details of what percentage did this in that year, and so on and so forth, then they are more likely to be frontal lefts. But you may be talking to them in the wrong way, because you just don't know by looking at them which they prefer. Let me use one more example of this in a slightly funnier way to emphasize these differences. There is a lovely American phrase. Are there any Americans in the group here or not? Not sure, I don't think so. Lovely
not going to say
no,
are they?
Sorry?
They're not going to say now anyway.
They're not, are they? Don't worry, this is not a bad thing necessarily, but there's a wonderful American expression. I can't do it with the right accent, but it's, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And when I was running businesses in the United States in the late 1990s, it was very popular. It was a way of saying, you know, get on with other stuff and leave the stuff that's working alone. And quite honestly, if you are someone who naturally has a thinking style that is down in this basal left area, you like routines, you like things, you don't like change, you like things to be the same. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. On the other hand, if you are a frontal left who prefers something a bit more challenging, like measuring things, analyzing things, improving things, then you would probably say, well, if it ain't broke, let's analyze it and then let's improve it, because you think everything can be improved if you're up in that area here. Skipping across to the right brain, if you're a basal right, you're probably saying, well, if it isn't broken, if we ain't broke, why are we even talking about it? You know, because it's not important. And if, like David, you are a frontal right, you'd be saying, well, if it ain't broke, let's break it in anyway and find a new way of doing things, because it's much more exciting, much more interesting if we get on with something new. And I'm joking a little bit when I talk about David there, but David is, actually, I didn't ask your permission in advance, David, so I've probably gone too far here, but David is a strong frontal right, and he would tend to look for new and interesting solutions to a problem rather than continuing doing things the same way, as opposed to someone who's a basal left. Now, there are other ways of looking at this. I don't want you to think that this is just me coming up with some quick analysis. We won't get into it here, but I have a chart in front of you at the moment, which is on cognitive style and values. And a lot of research has also been done into values. And these are the 10 values in the middle here, which you can more or less unite people around the world on. These are the values that people lead their lives around, the things which are most important for people. And these too can be grouped in exactly the same way. As you're seeing, the idea of openness to change correlates to this frontal right, stimulation, doing things in a new way, as opposed to security, conformity of the basal left. And when you have values which value self-enhancement, then achievement and power are important for you. And if you are someone who is in this basal right area, self-transcendence, then benevolence, universalism, bringing people together is more important. So there are different fields of research which are leading you to this same way of doing things. But in the end, it is the polarization here and the fact that you look at people and you just don't know what's going on. And I'm using this visual here as a little example. It's just a stock image from iStock, but here's a little family. You look at it, imagine they came to your school. Well, you'd see a little visual diversity there. You certainly see diversity of colors, if that's interesting for you. If you're a frontal right, you're more of a color person than others. But firstly, you don't know what their thinking style is, so you don't quite know how to address them, because you don't know if they're more interested in facts and figures or the warm feelings of your school. And equally, you don't even know if the husband and wife or man and partner here, if they have similar images themselves. And I would suggest to you that part of the role in working with families is even to try and find out if the parents are on the same page. You probably know better than I do that sometimes they aren't. And it's not necessarily that they're having a violent disagreement, it's just that they see things differently. So the final chart before you come back to me is this one here, which I've sent as a PDF to David, if you wish to share it. It's a list for you, a kind of cheat list, which puts together some aspects which are typically found amongst these different thinking style types. Now, of course, we are all a mixture of these, as you saw from this kite I showed. And yet, somehow, one of these tends to dominate for us, and you'll have a chance to see that separately afterwards. So if I bring you back into view, I've probably gone on a little bit long there, but when David spoke to me, I thought the interesting thing was effectively to challenge you a little to think of not only diversity in a different way, but to think of all these different people that you interact with, either internally or when you get new parents coming to you, and saying, is there a way that I could connect better with them and reflect the values of our school in a way which is more relevant to them if I knew something about the thinking styles that they have. And that, David, is roughly what I wanted to talk to you about.